Well, on that note, let's shift our focus to other data coming out today. Trade between China and Africa reached an all-time high in 2021. That's an estimated $254 billion. Now, this marks a 35% year-on-year increase that surpasses pre-COVID levels. China exported goods worth $148 billion, up 29.9%. That's compared to 2020. It also received imports from Africa worth $106 billion, marking a rise of 43.7%. Now, in 2020, trade dropped 11% year-on-year to $187 billion due to the coronavirus pandemic control measures imposed across the world. South Africa took the lion's share of China's trade with about $54 billion last year. That's followed by Nigeria at $26 billion, Angola with $23 billion, and Egypt with $19 billion. Well, let's now take this apart further with Zainab Usman. She's director of the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Great to have you with us, as always, on the show, Zainab. Now, of course, as I just mentioned, in 2020, we saw trade between China and Africa surpassing even pre-COVID-19 numbers. Some, of course, point to Beijing's recent push to boost African imports as a key reason for these numbers, and also rising commodity prices. What are your thoughts on what's fueling this record highs, and certainly what they reveal about China-Africa relations so far?
Yes, indeed. Good to be here. So, as you rightly mentioned, we have seen a surge in trade between Africa and China, which is even more than the pre-pandemic level. And this has cemented China's position as Africa's top trade partner, followed by the US, whose trade with Africa stood at around $58 billion in 2021. Now, then the question is, what is driving this increase in the trade volume between African countries and China? It seems that when you look at the figures, it is largely driven by exports from China to the African continent. So you also mentioned that in 2021, China shipped around $448 billion worth of goods to Africa and imported $106 billion in return. So there's some kind of deficit there in the relationship. And when you really drill deeper down, you find that, even though the pandemic has disrupted trade and economic activity globally, but it did not really dampen demand for essential goods such as pharmaceuticals, personal protective equipment, PPEs, masks, hazmat suits, medication, chemicals, but also very importantly, digital hardware like mobile phones, computer, and accessories. All of these things are things that were very essential and are still essential as different individuals, household, communities, countries navigate the pandemic. And in fact, these are sectors that, according to, I think, a report by UNCTAD, had sustained demand throughout 2020 and 2021. And very importantly, these are sectors in which China is a major producer. So you have to look at the sectors. I think another thing I would mention is that even though there's a kind of trade imbalance there between exports from China and imports from Africa into China, we have also seen that exports from some African countries have actually increased within this period in 2021. So countries like Libya and Benin, their exports to China actually quadrupled. And there were increases also from Togo, Sao Tome and Principe, Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, and a couple of other countries. Now, the other part of your question is, what does this tell us about the relations between African countries and China? I would say maybe two things very quickly. The first is that trade and more broadly economic engagement between China and Africa, this is really not declining, right? In the past couple of weeks, especially after the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation concluded, there was a lot of talk in some quarters that China is disengaging from Africa for a variety of reasons, including due to challenges in its domestic economy or the changing geopolitical environment or even increased risk in some African countries. But the numbers we're seeing around trade volumes clearly do not support this argument. Then I think another broader implication for China-Africa relations here is that we're seeing, despite the rising trade volume, that there are some familiar patterns that persist in this economic and trade relationship. So the trade imbalance, which is very clear, weighs heavily in favor of China because it exports more to Africa, and those exports are mostly finished goods and manufactures, whereas it imports primary commodities from China, from Africa. And
Right.
then the top trade partners in Africa are mostly commodity producers: Nigeria, Angola, DRC, etc. So we're seeing some familiar patterns there persist.
Quite right. And which leads me to my next question. Africa accounts for just 4.2% of China's $6 trillion international commerce portfolio, and that was in 2021. Now, coupled with what you just mentioned, which is the reality that most African exports to China are dominated by raw materials and unprocessed products, and that, of course, results in a trade surplus in China's favor. Are we likely to see any substantial change in this anytime soon? What is your outlook?
So the first part of your question around that Africa constitutes just around 4% of China's global trade. I think that is true, but then you have to see things maybe from the perspective of African countries. That 4%, or the $250+ billion is a lot, for African countries. So globally, yes, it sounds like a very small fraction, but for African countries, that is actually quite significant, and they would even want more trade, not just with China, but with the US, with the EU, with other parts of the world. And then are things going to change? Is there likely to be change? Change could happen, yes, in this trade relationship, in trying to rebalance that deficit that we have spoken about, but it will not happen on its own. It has to be driven by policies, by concerted efforts. So policies and efforts on behalf of, on the part of African policymakers. They need to implement productivity enhancing policies, increase connectivity infrastructure, focus on e-commerce in particular, because what we've seen during this pandemic is that a lot of African traders, business people who would typically travel physically to China, Guangzhou, and other parts of China could not travel. So they had to rely on e-commerce, right? So African countries need to enhance and support e-commerce. That would be one example. And just basically policies that support small businesses and remove non-tariff trade barriers. Then Chinese policymakers also need to relax trade barriers. And I know this is a topic that has come up frequently in engagement with African policymakers. There are some stringent requirements for non-commodity exports to Africa. So one example that is often given is in East Africa, Kenya in particular. A lot of Kenyan farmers want to export avocados, some processed avocados to China, but the regulations, the requirements around that to flash freeze those avocados before exports is quite onerous, and they've only just begun to meet those regulations. And then Chinese policymakers have to make good on their promises to increase market access to to processed goods, to manufacturers from African countries to China.